Now the discussion in the conference in the next panel will focus on scholarly communications actors, notably libraries, publishers, and related networks. And of course, we will have a representation from academia as well. We've heard so many things about libraries, publishers, and academia today, but without adding any more comments, I want to give the floor to our colleague, Dr. Mohammed Zuhair Bakle, who has been invited to moderate the panel. Dr. Bakle is the Chief Librarian leading the Knowledge Management Unit at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, stationed in Beirut, Lebanon. He has more than 30 years of professional experience in managing libraries of different sizes and scopes at national and regional level. He is currently leading the establishment of the UN Regional Training Center on Public Policy on Sustainable Development and the institution's e-learning platform. He also enjoys a notable academic experience and career in the areas of information and knowledge management. Dr. Bakle holds a PhD in Library Information Services Management, a Master's degree in Library Information Management, and 2 postgraduate diplomas in Knowledge Management and Administration. He has led information knowledge management initiatives in several entities, such as the British Council, the Syrian Atomic Energy Agency, and the Damascus University, among others. Dr. Bakle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thanos. Thanks a lot. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, colleagues. Welcome to the final panel, and I will try to manage the remaining time as we can. And as Juan Pablo mentioned earlier, that the uniqueness of this conference is its global dimension. And since we did not have any speaker from the Middle East and North Africa region, I would like quickly and briefly share with you the main outcomes of the Regional Arab Virtual Meeting for Open Science and Research, which was held in August 2020 during the pandemic and organized by the UNESCO Regional Office in Egypt. The meeting discussed the best strategies and approaches for advancing the open science agenda in the Arab region, which suffers, as a region from serious issues related to climate change, including desertification, lack of access to drinking clean water, increased temperature, pollution, and others. The interactive discussion and deliberation throughout the meeting recommended to, and I will just briefly quote, enhance regional participation of the science community and raise awareness and communication to build a regional culture on open science, adopt scientific research and innovation policies, strategies, and legal frameworks that will foster scientific collaboration at the national and regional level. Build the required digital infrastructure with expanded use of information and communication technology. Explore and support open science opportunities, address challenges, and promote best practices from global and regional perspective for sustainable development, with special focus on finding solutions and complex socio-economic issues such as climate change. Promote and enhance participatory science, adopt inclusive and participatory approaches within the cycle of scientific research, build partnerships at the regional and international levels, and finally support the involvement of young researchers in the formation of open science policies and practices. And try to summarize, it shows that the open science challenge in the Arab region is not that different from the global ones that we have been hearing. And in this panel, the scholarly communication panel, we will hear from scholarly, as Thanos said, from scholarly communication actors, including universities, libraries, and relevant institutions. And the focus will be on challenges, best practices, and opportunities for generating a greater access to scientific knowledge, building from lessons learned during the pandemic. In this panel, we have 4 distinguished speakers who will intervene in the following order. Mr. Vincent Lariveri, the professor at the School of Library and Information Science at University of Montreal. Ms. Claire Redhead, the executive director from Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association. Ms. Stefka Zanova, the science librarian and academic works coordinator, assistant professor at the City University of New York. And finally, Ms. Irina Kushma, from Open Access Program Manager at IFL, Electronic Information for Libraries. And I will be posting short biographies of the speakers on the chat. in the sequence of their intervention for the sake of time, and also for the audience, if you please can type your questions in the Q&A sidebar. And without further ado and time pressure, I would like to give the floor to our distinguished speakers, starting with Dr. Vincent Lariveri. And Doctor, if you can, adhere to the 10 minutes provided time frame. So Dr. Vincent, the floor is yours.
Thank you so Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Can someone put up my slides? I don't see them. Okay, excellent. So my talk is going to be about what the pandemic can teach us about open science practices. So I'm going to basically show a couple of empirical results about what we're seeing in terms of open science practicing with the COVID, let's say, research front, and then show a couple of results on what we actually see related to climate change. And so we're going to see that there's things that we've managed to do collectively for COVID, which we have not done for climate change. Next slide, please. So I'm going to first present some results on open access to papers. Then I'm going to say a couple of words on open data. Then the focus on national dissemination, which has already been discussed a bit in the previous panel. And then I'm going to conclude with a couple of action forward, which again, will probably resonate with a lot of the things that have been said earlier, which is not really a bad thing. There kind of seems that there's a general agreement about what should be done. As has been said in the previous panel, we just need to follow through and put our money where our mouth is. Next slide, please. So about 18 months ago, many funders and publishers agreed that open data and open access to papers was something actually really important to solve the COVID crisis. So the Wellcome Trust, Elsevier, basically major players in the ecosystem basically got together and really tried to, let's say, make things better. We can debate why they did it, sometimes for good reason, maybe in some other cases more for reasons of public relations, but in the end, there's a couple of things that have worked. Next slide, please. So first thing that we see is that last year, so 2020, was the year where the highest number of papers ever published happened in the history of the world. So basically, we increased the overall output of about 1 million papers between 2019 and 2020. So really, there is something that has happened. There has been more research that has been done, and the crisis, the COVID crisis, did not really, let's say, stop scientific progress. So really managed even in a pandemic to actually do more research than ever before. Next slide, please. And what we're seeing is that, well, overall, a big part of this output was actually related to COVID. So what you have here is the evolution of the number of papers on COVID versus climate change. And here I have a relatively broad definition of COVID, which also includes the previous SARS epidemics, as well as coronaviruses in general. So as you can see, it's a crazy sharp increase of several orders of magnitude, while the number of papers on climate change is increasing more at one could call a normal pace. So the shock on the system has been much different between COVID and climate change research. Next slide, please. And I will move on to the next also again. Yeah, exactly. So what is striking is that a huge proportion of COVID papers have actually been made available in open access. So the global pledge that has been done by publishers and funders actually mostly worked. So between 88 to 90% of papers on the topic are actually freely available online. Of course, one may argue that we would need 100%, and I would actually agree with that. And we also see on that figure that the most recent papers in 2020 and 2021 are actually less available in open access than those in 2019, which shows that there are still issues with embargoes, but by and large, this has mostly worked. The other thing that we could add to, let's say, tone this down a bit is that a lot of those papers are available in bronze OA, which means that it may only be temporary open access. And this is something that many for-profit publishers have mentioned, that they would give access to the papers during the pandemic, and then after that, that would be closed. So this is not to say that everything went perfectly, but one thing is sure, we do have the vast majority of papers on the topic freely available on open access. Next slide. Now compare that with climate change. We're actually seeing that there's much less open access papers that are available. And so it's as if, like the scientific community, when there's a major shock, people can step up, but when it's a kind of a distant threat, well, we've got time, we don't have to move as quickly. And so globally, there's much less open access papers on what can be considered by many as a much more important threat, which is climate change, than on COVID-related papers. Next slide, please. Again, pointing in this direction, when it comes to COVID papers, almost all countries manage to produce an output that is freely available. And again, at the same level, again, about 85 to 90% of papers freely available. Next slide. Again, in terms of climate change, much lower, and again, much more variability. Open access mandates in the UK work much better. Their open access rate is higher, and much lower open access papers for China and India. Next slide. What I find actually striking here is how for-profit publishers behave in the, let's say, two emergencies. So this is the percentage of open access papers for Wiley, Springer, and Elsevier, as well as for all of the other papers, all of the other publishers, sorry. What we actually see there is that for-profit publishers have a higher open access rate in terms of COVID papers than the rest of the publishers, which includes both smaller platforms, smaller for-profit publishers, etc. So in that case, they have indeed stepped up and made papers available, and in some cases, in the case of Springer and Elsevier, close to not 100%, but not so far from it. Of course, there's the embargo thing, which shows a decrease for the last year, but globally pretty high. Next slide. Now, when we're looking at climate change, it's the opposite. So papers from these commercial publishers are much less likely to be available in open access than those of other publishers. So they managed to do it for COVID, but they have not managed to do it, and I'm saying it in a kind manner, for the other more long-term threat, which is climate change. Next slide. Very quickly, another change that we've seen in the COVID pandemic and that we have not really seen in the case of climate change is the temporary growth of preprint, where in the first couple of months of the pandemic, crazy rise in the number of preprint. Now it's a bit more stable, coming back to levels that were more average. We have not seen something like that in the case of the climate change crisis. Next slide. Second thing that I want to talk about is open data. So again, in the pledge of the Wellcome Trust and other organization, there was kind of an implicit open data mandate. What is interesting there is that it has worked, but only to a certain extent. So looking at the data, so here what we have is a proportion of papers in medRxiv that have a data availability statement. And what does that data availability statement says? Well, basically, a minority of papers have totally open data. In most cases, it's conditional availability. So there's a relatively good success in terms of open access to papers in the case of the COVID case. In the case of open data for COVID, it's much lower, which shows that open data and open access are, in a way, they're quite different. They lead to different types of, they need different types of incentives, and there's different challenges associated with that. So there's much more work to be done on that front. Next slide, please. Last point that I want to talk is national dissemination. So in the early weeks of the pandemic, the Chinese government, which has over the last basically 2 decades, made everything so that their researchers would publish in English in international journals, realized all of the adverse effect of such practices when it comes to, again, access to knowledge for the national communities that actually have to make decisions in various health policies and educational policies, etc. So what they did very quickly is to put up a new condition for their funding, which is to publish in national journals. So researchers have to publish a certain percentage of their papers in Chinese in national journals, which will lead, hopefully, to a new multilingualism and more diversity, one may say, in the researcher dissemination languages. We can totally apply that to climate change, which is a scientific problem that has a strong social component. And in that context, the general public in all languages needs to be able to access to the scholarly literature. So collectively, we need to put up similar policies so that climate change is treated in the same manner as this emergency that we've seen with COVID. Next slide. So 4 steps forward, which again will resonate with some others have said. The first thing is that in order to solve the general research evaluation scholarly communication crisis, we need to decouple them. Historically, researchers would publish when they have something to say. Now researchers need to publish to be properly evaluated, and we need to distinguish the two. Let's evaluate researchers through peer review and let them publish when they have something to say, and let's not evaluate them by basically the journal in which they publish, which is again the second point here. We need to get rid of all journal level indicators of prestige. They have much more adverse effects than anything else. They are meaningless in many ways. You know, medical doctors have a motto that says first do no harm, and I think that research evaluators should adopt the same thing. We need, of course, to develop new incentives. So openness can be a quality, social relevance can be a quality, and we need to go more in this direction than any citation bibliometric-based research indicators. And I agree again with what has been said in the last panel. We need to strengthen community-owned means of disseminations. Right now, the control of corporate publishers is huge, and they control both the research evaluation and the scholarly communication system together, and they create systems that basically reinforce each other. We need to get out of that. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussions.
Warm greetings from your college, the City University of New York. I'm really thrilled to be in such a distinguished company today. The topic of my presentation is Open Science in Time of COVID, Lesson Learned in an Academic Library. When political leaders closed the borders, scientists and librarians adopted new access practices and started sharing research data in order to create a united front and facilitate collaboration across the globe. In the beginning of the pandemic, many publishers provided free access to peer-reviewed research information on COVID. Some textbook publishers granted universities temporary free access to their electronic textbook collections. The Internet Archive launched the National Emergency Digital Library. Are we on the brink of open science revolution? I wish I could give an affirmative answer to this question, but the truth is that we're not there yet. Next slide, please. Open science is not an utopia, but it's a matter of survival, and the only way information can be disseminated rapidly enough in order to overcome the pandemic. Open science is a direct result from changes in the research process and the increasing need of collaborative and interdisciplinary research. It's a global, cultural, and social phenomenon. Open science movement, it's an effort to make scientific data a public good in contrast to the expansion of intellectual property right over knowledge exchange. The core concept is openness of all aspects of scientific research, from access to data to scientific publications. Let's look at the entity of open science and its elements in the context of libraries. From the academic library perspective, the components with the greatest impacts are open access, open data, open science evaluation, and open science tools, and especially the open repositories. Next slide, please. Libraries, and especially academic libraries, have always been at the forefront of scientific progress, with their role shifting from providing access to scholarly communications toward assisting researchers in its creation. I want to highlight the following stages of the research life cycle: planning of the research process, data collection, evaluation and review, and scientific publications. I'm going to examine the new roles of academic librarians as enablers, promoters of research diversity, and research advisors in the context of the open science framework. Librarians, and especially academic librarians, can be involved in all these stages of the research process. Next, please. In order to support the open science as a mainstream model, the academic librarians have taken on a new role to preserve, curate, publish, and disseminate digital scientific materials in the form of publications, data, and other research-related content. Librarians became involved in creation of tailored data support for interdisciplinary research terms and providing easy access to data repositories and supporting materials. In addition, librarians became engaged in building curated institutional repositories and ensuring interoperability of data. Speaking of personal experience, I have to admit that convincing our faculty to share their data, research, and scholarship on academic works, the CUNY Open Access Repository, it proves to be quite challenging. Librarians' efforts sometimes were met with skepticism due to misunderstanding or social media fatigue in faculty. Thanks to the dedicated efforts of the scholarly communications librarian, the latest collection, COVID-19 Research by CUNY Authors, is posted on academic works along with the other repository series, publications and research, dissertation, thesis, archival works, and open educational resources. Next, please. In the core of the role of academic librarians as promoters of research diversity is the data curation. Large amount of open data already exist in media blogs or social network sites, but these data are usually not curated. Therefore, they are not suitable to reuse for the purpose of scientific research. The challenge there is creating adequate metadata and policy ensuring sustained access. Data curation makes some of these data available, but more importantly, it helps overcome the publication bias in science. The publication bias in science stems from scholars' willingness to publish only in high-impact journals. This leads to self-censorship and removal of large amount of data and experimental output that are judged to be not citable. For instance, only successful experiments outputs are being reported in peer-reviewed literature, and all other experimental results are ignored despite their value for advancing the science. Similarly, the editors contribute to the publication bias by applying criteria dominated by non-scientific considerations, such as political conjuncture. As a result, significant part of valuable research remains hidden and therefore defeating the purpose of data as generator of research ideas. Or in layman terms, we have elimination of research serendipity. Next, please. Academic librarians are well placed to take on a role of research advisors too, because they can offer their subject expertise and provide guidance during the exploratory stage of research or grant writing. At nationally competitive research universities, the collaborative and cross-disciplinary projects are predominant. From the university perspective, the partnership with various institutions not only ensures knowledge exchange regarding data management, but also stimulates the development of new library services benefiting from such technologies. This new role of librarians focuses not only on providing assistance in the exploratory stages of research, but also providing information to research teams, faculty, and scholars about publishing opportunities, data curation, data sharing, and publishing in data repositories. Next, please. All librarians, academic, public, medical, special, have the responsibility to share evidence-based information about public health on all local, national, and international level during a pandemic. In the age of information deluge and fake news, it's library's civic duty as a social institution to ensure public health awareness and provide authoritative, up-to-date information to their patrons. Next, please. 1 year into the pandemic, the most important lesson we learn is that academic libraries are on the right track. For years, libraries have practiced just-in-case digitization of their special collections for preservation purposes. It took a pandemic to realize that the diminishing value of the print format. Investing in electronic resources really paid off, and now we focus on our efforts and shrinking acquisition budgets on e-book-centered collection development model. The open educational resources save the day. At CUNY, libraries have already taken the leadership role in creating and adopting open educational resources. Many libraries host and maintain OER content via LibGuides on their websites. In terms of library services, the focus shifted toward electronic interaction, scan and deliver service, virtual reference, online research consultation, and online information classes. We had a strong presence on social media. We realized how important it was to have a strong presence on social media. Librarians have been the first advocates for open access publishing and research dissemination through institutional repositories. Academic librarians have to take a stance on including open research and open data closed in federal grants because the institutional repositories are no more just a showcase of researcher scholarship. They are a valuable information resources tool. Next. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you so much to the United Nations and the organisers of this conference. It's a great honour to be invited to participate. And it's been a really inspiring 3 days and wonderful to hear the willingness from so many stakeholders to build open scholarship systems that can help us work together to tackle global challenges, as well as acknowledging the areas where we need to focus our efforts in order to do better. So today, giving a publishing perspective for this conference, I'm going to zoom in on the details of what's been happening with open publishing of COVID-19 research, where we can see efficiencies and good things that we'd want to hold on to, and then look at how things stand with open publishing of climate research. Next slide, please. So firstly, just a little bit about OASPA. OASPA is a diverse community of organisations engaged in open scholarship, with members covering open access journals and books in all disciplines across a variety of models, and crucially also including services, infrastructure and software that support open publishing, including at academic institutions. OASPA's mission is to encourage and enable open access as the predominant model of communication for scholarly outputs, and we do this by supporting a variety of models, promoting innovative approaches and convening the community to share experiences and new developments. And we have a history of setting standards for open access publishing and for collaborating with other organisations to support open access beyond our membership. Next slide, please. So as researchers all over the world work to learn more about COVID-19 and its impact, there was no question that content should be published open access, showing widespread agreement that this is the best approach for sharing findings, for others to build on them, and to reduce duplication of efforts. More than 90% of the early literature was open access, including content opened up by some publishers which would ordinarily have been paywalled. Adaptations to journal peer review were demonstrated by a group of publishers and related organisations who collaborated to ensure that COVID-19 papers were reviewed and published as quickly as openly as possible. And they did this by expanding the review pool, porting reviews between publishers, actively encouraging preprints and mandating data deposition. And at the same time, we saw the journal eLife moving to include preprint publishing by default. The peer review process remains integral, but the pressures for researchers were reduced. All of the links in these slides, I think they'll be shared. They're to research papers or further reading. Next slide, please. So other initiatives focused on adding review to preprints themselves. So there was Outbreak Science Pre-Review and also Rapid Reviews COVID-19, which is an MIT Press overlay journal. These are really positive developments that do have potential to improve the transparency and equity in publishing, but we have learned that they're resource intensive, and so these kind of initiatives will need support in order to have stability in the longer term. Next slide, please. The use of preprints was already growing, and studies have tracked the acceleration during this pandemic. Many authors using preprints did so for the first time, and a recent survey showed that most of these would do so again to achieve rapid and early dissemination and to make work openly available. COVID preprints were published faster than other subjects, and preprint servers hosted almost 25% of COVID-19 related science. Next slide, please. But the volume of COVID-19 submissions put a strain on the journal publishing system and also led to issues with data and code availability. And overall data sharing via publications was low. Less than 30% of articles provided a link to at least one data set. Adoption of even greater open science practices would have avoided research duplication, dubious quality and retractions. But centralised data sharing, for example, the CORD-19 database, is a positive, with this in particular becoming a de facto standard for text and data mining. Next slide, please. But there's caution too that the limitations of preprints without peer review are made clear to non-academic audiences and are considered across all formats by which preprints are downloaded and shared. And this is especially important given the growing usage of preprints in the media and in policy decision making. Studies monitoring COVID-19 preprints and subsequent journal publication show journals remained the main way of disseminating peer-reviewed research outputs. In the survey of preprint authors I mentioned, 86% of authors had submitted their work to a peer-reviewed journal, and COVID-19 research, I've realised I'm out of sync with my slides, apologies. COVID-19 research has provided a unique set of data about publications which we've been able to track, showing that the median time for peer review in journals is about 5.5 months. So yes, now we'll have a look at how do things look for open publishing and climate research. So while we all agree here during this conference that there is a climate crisis to be addressed, in terms of the volume of research and the urgency, it's quite a different picture to the COVID-19 response. Less than half of published climate science is openly available, and this, as Vincent said, includes content only free to read and not openly licensed for reuse. There are fewer fully open access journals, and so most of the open access climate research is published in hybrid journals, which of course have APCs and will be typically higher than average at that. Many journals are also not driving open science practices, such as data sharing. But PLOS, for example, has recently launched a new climate journal which can fulfil not only the open access and open science requirements, but also is intended to amplify perspectives from underrepresented voices and regions. And PLOS is also experimenting with alternatives to APCs, introducing new funding models that are more equitable or are based on a collective funding approach. So you can see here that in 2020 there was far more published COVID research output, and the preprints are a really significant chunk, plus nearly all of those articles are openly available, or are at the moment at least. For climate research, preprints are playing a much smaller part, and although growing, preprinting is not the norm. Also, less than half of the rest of that content from 2020 is open access, and across all years it averages out at less than 40%. So there's a big difference in availability of research findings as a whole. Next slide, please. This shows the growth in climate research publications over the past 5 years. The open access share is growing slowly, but in fact all climate research is growing, paywalled content too. And I've compared it with the growth in disciplines to show that open access versus paywalled is a pretty similar picture. So climate research is similar to the average trends, and there's certainly no sign that open access content is growing particularly fast. Next slide, please. This is just a flag here. No, sorry, can you go back? Because I put these two side to side, but I wanted to point out they're on a very, very different scale. If you put them on the same slide, you can't see the climate research. Also, I filtered the publication data by the SDGs and selected climate action, but there are other SDGs such as clean energy, for example, which are going to have important research, or we might need agricultural data or insect biodiversity or habitat loss. And I've included all kinds of publications, so books and long form works. We don't know where the creative and ideas and solutions that we need will come from. So I haven't limited it to journal articles. Basically, we need access to everything. There's a, sorry, next slide, please. There's a lot of great research taking place into the process of scholarly communication itself, and it's this kind of evidence that I've been sharing today. And it's really important that these studies are all brought together to give us a better picture of what's happening. And the Research and Research Institute has been set up by the group of organisations shown here to do that meta research. So next slide, please. We still need to work to make more research immediately available as open access, and for that to happen faster. And in order to have the widest possible benefit, research outputs need to be discoverable, reusable, and have associated data. Preprints provide a successful mechanism for more rapid sharing of results, but adding peer review of some kind remains fundamental for trust in scholarly communication. Experiments show, however, that peer review can be applied to varying degrees and at different stages in the publishing process to reduce burden and increase efficiency. We can see that things can be done differently. I've been encouraged by the calls for a change in research culture and assessment to support open practices, and this definitely needs urgent attention. And there's a need to continue to build an evidence base of what is working and what isn't, for us to benefit from the innovations and experiments in scholarly communication. To tackle global challenges, there's an imperative to share knowledge across and within countries, and crucially, to ensure that none are excluded from accessing or contributing to research, whether that be by financial or language barrier, or unable to benefit from the solutions that arise from it. Continued work is needed on the financial mechanisms underpinning research communication and open science, both publishing and the supporting infrastructure, to move away from the constraints we have now and to ensure a fair and equitable system for open scholarship in the future. And finally, open access and reuse of content is just a building block of open science, but it's certainly not possible to predetermine what research should be open. The world needs access to all the collective knowledge we have in order to be as well equipped as possible to develop solutions for the global challenges facing humanity. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion with my fellow panelists.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Let me speak on behalf of our partner academic and public libraries in over 50 countries in Africa, Asia, and Europe. And on the slide you see blue countries where we collaborate on a national level with National Library Consortia, and grey countries are the countries where we implement access to knowledge projects. And if we could go to the next slide, please. And here I listed 3 lessons learned that we learned in open science from the pandemic that we can take over to discussing climate changes. And that's really a beauty to be the last speaker, because we already discussed that there was a significant growth of preprints, and what I would like to stress that we already have workflows in place to flag those preprints as preprints and non-peer-reviewed research yet. Then we talked about data sharing, and what I would also like to stress that we still need to discuss responsible data sharing governance, because unfortunately not everyone is sharing benefits of research from the data that is being shared. And then, of course, I can only echo importance of open science infrastructures and sustainable funding for them. And I'd like to end my talk stressing the role that local journals, especially African journals, played in disseminating COVID-19 research, and I'll quickly run through the rest of my slides, but these are the main messages that I want to share with you. And if we could please go to the next slide. And we already talked that preprints are rising, and I'd like to highlight here recommendations that European Commission issued to the projects that covered COVID-19 related research, and the recommendation was make research finding available via preprint service before journal publication, or via platforms that make publications openly accessible before peer review, and include clear statements regarding the availability of underlying data. And I think data availability could address the question of quality of preprints that was discussed earlier. And if we could go to the next slide, please. It was also remarkable that Discovery Portal started indexing preprints together with peer-reviewed journal articles, and Europe PMC is one of the examples. But what I'd like to show is that preprints are clearly labeled. And if we could go to the next slide, please. I think that this preprints in the public eye project was really huge and remarkable, which provided guidelines to researchers and preprint servers on how to communicate preprints. And if you could please go to the next slide. And the next one. So we already have a set of recommendations how researchers could clearly say that this research hasn't been peer-reviewed yet. Also avoid overhyping the research results, and highlight that the work might have certain limitations, and there are other important recommendations that I think make it really easier for researchers and print servers to communicate preprints. And next slide, please. And that's, I guess, a policy recommendation that could be taken by research funders supporting climate change research, make research fundings available via preprint servers before journal publication, and clearly label them as non-peer-reviewed research. On my next slide, I'd like to share some learnings from COVID-19 guidelines and recommendations on data sharing that were collaboratively developed by over 600 professional experts within Research Data Alliance, and I was one of the coordinators for social sciences working group. And yesterday, Dr. Stephanie Carroll already highlighted some findings from indigenous data recommendations. And if we could please go to the next slide. The first three recommendations really important and relevant to COVID-19 research, of course, and climate change research. And if we could go to the next slide where I'm unpacking them. So this coordinated cross-jurisdictional effort to foster global science is important really for governments who would like to address climate change, as well as research funders. And it's also important to incentivize early publications of research fundings, including data and also software. And we haven't really talked a lot about governance, except yesterday when we talked about indigenous data governance, but these governance issues around data sharing platforms are really important and should be addressed to make sure that researchers really get benefits from sharing their research data and also other research outputs. And next slide, please. And then it's really important to move away from short scale, short period funding for infrastructures and really develop an international mechanism to support open, non-commercial public infrastructures for sharing data and also publications and other research outputs. And what's really important to remember that infrastructures are people, and investment should be made in supporting people running those infrastructures, training people, and also supporting researchers working with those infrastructures. And next slide, please. And we've seen with COVID-19 how important cross-disciplinary collaborations are, and cross-cultural data collection, and they are as important in climate change research. And also, even more with climate change research, we see public involvement in data gathering, and we still need to develop good workflows for collaborative citizen science and support their data sharing practices. So these are some of the challenges for climate change research. And on my last slides, I'd like to highlight that's the next slide, please. And we can go to the last one now. So there was a study that looked at how, sorry, the one before that. There was a study that looked at how African researchers who published on COVID-19 actually published their research outputs. And as you can see that some of them were initially shared as preprints. And then out of top 15 journals where that research was published, 3 were African journals: Pan-African Medical Journal, South African Medical Journal, and African Journal of Primary Health Care and Family Medicine. And all of them are local African open access journals. And that's my last slide. And recommendation, if we could take it over, that it's really important to encourage and incentivize publishing in local open access journals, and do not discriminate against such publications at tenure and promotion exercises. And recommendations to journals that we included in RDA COVID-19 data sharing guidelines was that journals should expedite review process for COVID-19 research, and I think that would be great if the same could happen with climate change research, so that we could really have peer-reviewed research results on climate change as soon as possible. And thank you so much, and again, my sincere apologies for the glitches.
From the audience, does the OASPA participate in any initiative supporting the Diamond non-ABC open access publishing?
Yes, we do. So OASPA has a variety of different kinds of members, and some of them are publishing and some of them are services and infrastructure, as I said. Of the members that we have, most of them are fully open access, and also the majority of them don't charge fees. Lots of them are very small, and we work directly with them to support them and help them with standards, and we do some direct practical support in terms of we sponsor their DOIs, so we cover the cost of their Crossref membership. And we also work with other organisations like the DOAJ and others that we were involved in the study on diamond journals as well. So I took part in the coalition that worked on that for Coalition S. So yes, we do.
Vincent, I have a comment and a question from Fernanda Wiegel. Very interesting empirical findings. I have observed quite a lot of resistance to preprints in Latin America. The COVID boost for preprint was even in all regions. Do you think it will broaden to other topics, or it's a conjunctional phenomenon?
It's a good question. Actually, a year ago, I would have said it's done, preprints will be everywhere, and people have realized that this is an important step forward. And right now, I must say that I'm a bit more cautious. So the fact that even in medical research and even in COVID-related research, academics seems to go back into their old habits. I'm a bit skeptical, I would say, unfortunately, that preprints may not yet become the norm. Of course, the issue of peer review is one thing, but again, going back to scientific capital, and even if preprints are in most cases published as scholarly papers afterward, there is something there about, again, the capital associated with journals, which creates some resistance. And again, the last thing that I'd say is that there's still a lack of education, in the sense that many researchers believe that they cannot do that it's not, that journals don't allow it. So it means that we need more education, and we need to provide with, again, better evidence that this is useful for science collectively.
Stefka had a question from the audience. It's about regarding platforms and repositories that hold and share reprints. How could we determine when a manuscript has been thoroughly reviewed? And also to other panelists if they want to add to this. So Stefka, please.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute myself.
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me. That's perfect. So the icon shows that I'm muted. Sorry. I have to say that there is no peer review process across the institutional repository I'm familiar with. And I'm speaking of personal experience at Academic Works. Because it's a self-service. Of course, there is this very important role of the scholarly communications librarian, who is aided by a cohort of coordinator on the different campuses. The system of the City University of New York includes 24 colleges. So it's a self-service, so to speak. And there is no formal process. Most of the publications there are preprint because not all the colleges have subscription to the expensive journals, so the pre-print version is posted there just in order to ease the access, but we rely on the peer review process done by the editors, and the formal review just is not done. And speaking of theses, or open educational resources, it's how to put it on an honor system.
Can I add to that very quickly?
Yes, please. Go ahead,
yes. So basically, what the COVID pandemic has shown us is that, of course, preprints are not peer-reviewed yet. And one may say that they're not peer-reviewed externally, because, of course, authors and collaborators have gone through the manuscript and revised it. So it doesn't mean that there's no review when a paper is published as a preprint. But what the pandemic has shown is that peer review, and we knew it, but we had, again, additional evidence, is not perfect. We've seen peer-reviewed manuscript that had to be retracted, both for mistakes as well as relatively important fraud, and these were not published in low-tier journals. So again, the borders or frontiers between peer-reviewed literature and non-peer-reviewed literature is kind of a big gray area, and I think that points in the directions that, again, preprints are necessary, because, again, the scientific community is quite good at criticizing itself in its own papers.
A small question, maybe we can elaborate. What about quality control, institutional peer review before submission? That was normal in the early days. So,
yeah, can I answer? Yes, the quality control is exercised by the scholarly communications librarian, who is highly qualified and is with outstanding academic records. And we don't have some formal body. She does the reviewing of the article. It's not just like peer review. She compares and makes sure that copyright is not violated, that all the information is correct, like institution affiliation, stuff like that. And then she gives the approval, and it's posted. When I say posted, I mean it just appears on the web. it is visible for the rest of the world. And we worry about other things. I see here that the distinction peer review, non-peer review, we are very concerned about predatory publishers. So our main question is this journal a predatory journal or not? And somehow the peer review clause is kind of on the background. It's not just very concerning. Thank you.
So in the early days, before we submitted the paper to a journal, whatever, there was internal institutional peer review, very rigid, and that is gone. That is nowhere to be found anymore. And so if you go back to that system, and that's another idea of quality control than the librarian can do. This is really about science and colleagues who are tough, and this is not going. We have lost that, and I think there's a lot to gain there because peer review, I don't trust it either.
I think we have time for a few questions, so I thank all the panelists. And if anybody from the audience has any question, if you can post it in the Q&A. I had a question from the audience for all our panelists who would like, anybody who would like to answer. It's about the UNESCO Cultural Diversity Summit proposes to protect and promote cultural diversity in addition to the human rights framework. How to include indigenous people and their traditional and ancestral knowledge in open science policies and plans. This knowledge has proven to be of a great importance for sustainable development, and its economic benefits do not reach their communities. So anybody from our panelists would like to answer?
Perhaps I could start because we talked a lot about that when we discussed COVID-19 recommendations. So it's really important that those local communities participate in discussions how to enable better sharing of information, if that kind of information could even be shared, because maybe there are some community practices that should be kept within the communities. And then we already have a lot of input from citizen science in documenting endangered species and contributing to the Red Book. And I am the one who did that with my sister, who is a Broadword chair. And we often participate as citizen scientists in observations and contribute data. So there are workflows for that, and it's really important to take an active role from communities and citizen scientists.
Yeah, thank you very much, Irina. Anyway, anybody would like to add anything on that one? Okay. Another question.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Sorry, I was just going to follow on from Irina's presentation, actually, and her emphasis on local publications, preserving regional knowledge, and I think the multilingualism aspect and including translation as well, so that knowledge can be used by those communities.
That's clear. Stefka, Vincent, I don't know if you have anything on this.
Not on this question.
Yeah, we had another question again for all the panelists. How can we reach a federated approach to research data management? Vincent, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Good. Well, research data management is a bit more challenging. Like open access, as I would say, even if it's not perfect, more one-size-fits-all type of thing. The thing is that with data, you've got data that is much more sensitive. Historically, when I was trained in the social sciences, we had to destroy our data after a couple of years. So we were at a totally different paradigm. Now we need to make sure that data are available, but still protected, given all of the ethical concerns. So it's a much more difficult thing to achieve with a one-size-fits-all thing, given the disciplinary differences in that. But we need probably to think of data as making people manage their data, but not necessarily always opening it, because again, those are two distinct things. You can have a proper data management thing and the data not be open. So we have, actually, to be honest, there's a lot of work to be done on that front, but I don't want to be pessimistic, but we have difficulties making access to papers, even if it's easier. Open data is quite challenging. The only good aspect one may say is that data is typically owned by researchers, not by commercial publishers. So that may help to make things better.
Anybody else like to comment on that one?
I can add that it's really important for researchers and research groups and universities and research institutes to take ownership and control of their research practices, and data sharing is one of the examples where I think it should start with a research group and discuss which and how data could be shared, and then that could be taken at the institutional level and discussed at the institutional level, then on the national level. And we have international organizations like CODATA or DA where these discussions could happen. So I'm really optimistic that we can move a bit faster with data sharing than with open access to publications.
Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes, and I would like to invite each panelist to offer 1 minute final words, trying to answer the following question, if possible, please. How do you expect the university research, the publishing system, the academic research libraries will be in 2030? And Irina, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think we should invest in people and skills, and the skills building should happen at the university level, but ideally even at the school level, so that we have a new generation of scientists equipped to work with data science.
Thank you very much. Claire?
I think developing an open science culture within institutions is key. I mean, often, all the work that we do in promoting open access, showing all the new alternative options that there are, and trying to get support for those, I'm still left wondering why it's not happening faster. And it's because of all these things, they're not being chosen, and there's a whole multitude of reasons that we've heard about over the past few days of why that's difficult. But that's where it needs to start.
Well, I'm going to go with a bold claim. So hopefully by 2030, all scholarly publishing will be nationalized. So publishing will be a collective good. So the infrastructures will be owned by the community. We will go back how it was 150 years ago, where basically scholarly societies were playing a big role. And of course, there's a long way to get there, but that's what we need to do. That is the only way out of the current system, which is only incrementally improving over the last couple of decades.
Thank you very much. Stefka, please go ahead.
I just lost connection for a minute, but I hope you can hear me now. Speaking for academic librarians, I can say that academic librarians have to reinvent themselves by expanding the traditional library collection and services and adopting new roles as enablers, promoters of research diversity, and research advisors. And these new roles require expanding their qualification beyond library science and subject degrees toward information technologies, data science, data curation, and electronic science. And if I may go back to the question about the data repositories and research data management, I want to make sure that all the audience understand that there are different, a variety of repositories. We can have the institutional repository of certain university, and we can have a data repository in the discipline. And as much as our colleagues are qualified and have subject degrees in addition of their Master of Library Science, we have master in subject area and very rarely even PhD in certain area, but we are not jack of all trades. So we need a partnership with the data repositories in specific areas. So establishing partnership between university institutional repository with data repository in some area for the benefit of open science and open research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I hand over to Thanos, I would like to thank our panelists for the wealth of information shared and interesting insights. So thank you very much, and over to you, Thanos.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buckley. And I want to also thank Dr. Vincent Lariviere, Ms. Claire Edmond, Dr. Steph Danova and Ms. Irina Kutsma for their interventions. Because our time, we're a little bit over time, I'm just going to go directly to some suggestions. Mostly these last 3 days have indeed been a journey into the many activities under the umbrella that is Open Science. We are thankful to all our speakers and moderators, and are delightful we were able to host you all at the cyberspace of the United Nations. We regret that there were some technical issues with the IT platform, but we have made note of this. In wrapping up this conference, I'd like to refer for a few minutes to some of the ideas, suggestions, and solutions that surfaced not only from the speakers and moderators, but mostly from the exchange between our audience and their lively participation in the Q&A. There was a flood of questions indeed on the keynotes, following the keynote speakers, following every panel, and indeed we did not have the time to address all those questions. We will follow up on this, but I wanted to a little bit sum up at the closing of this conference what are the main ideas, suggestions, solutions, and concerns of the over 2,000 people that are attending this conference. So first of all, it was acknowledged that there is a need to support the role of women and girls in science and to safeguard indigenous culture and direct of indigenous data. There are main opportunities and challenges for digital technologies. The communication of science is currently dysfunctional, high journal prices, change assessment. We need to change the assessment criteria. Both our two keynote speakers declared, and the audience actually agreed on it, that the print journal is actually dead, and if it is not, it should be. Platforms have the power and are the power, and all scholarly and communication stakeholders have a stake in powerful platforms. Metrics are important, but we need to apply new metrics to look at impact of science beyond just citations and downloads, and that was a recurring theme throughout the whole conference. There were questions like, what are the roles of funders in requiring open science processes? And there was a consensus that they have to work with governments and universities and libraries, and they have to cope with ranking tables. I mean, the universities have to cope with ranking tables and address those. The criteria are not clear. The universities must pull away from rankings. Young researchers don't hear about open science, and fears for careers in science actually inhibit the implementation of the full implementation of open science practices. Research integrity is essential, and that was acknowledged throughout the conference. We expect journals and editors to carry out a gatekeeping role, weeding out poor research methods, low quality data, and so on. However, are there any organizations at any level which audit the quality of the gatekeepers carried out by publishers? Is there any way to know which publishers perform research integrity checks on an acceptable standard? There are so many interaction stories, I will not delve into any of those. What was the role of social sciences? That was one of the questions, and the replies that our esteemed audience and esteemed colleagues offered was that the role of social science is to create and boost new interactions between science and civil society. Then about the roles of patents/profits. Monopolization on massive scale has dulled competition. Short-term profits damage the planet. Profits need to be guided by moral principles. Everyone has a role to play, both in a pandemic and the climate change scenario. The Paris Agreement was acknowledged as a good guide for some actions within state and non-state actors. It was interesting that the idea was put forward that open science is a two-directional movement, if not a multi-directional one. Change happens both from top down as well as bottom up. We had a riveting talk of many of the esteemed speakers. Just wanted to refer to Dr. Larivera. I'm sorry, this is just probably the freshest in my mind at this point, where he presented some comparative data So for research papers, openness was high during the COVID, but that is not the case at all for climate change data and climate change research output. And if it were, they were in this bronze model, which Jenny Baru has very eloquently called the publisher's whim. To that, I want to add the output of the Yale Communications Lab on climate change, who on the recent research into the public opinion of climate change concluded, one of the conclusions was that there is not enough research data available for the public to have an opinion. I also want to stress the comment put forward by our keynote speakers that when publishers talk about sustainability, they do not mean the same thing as is meant in the agenda and the work of the United Nations. Also, a recurring topic was how do we renew trust in science? Misinformation has spread faster than ever before. And it needs to be stopped at the source. We need to verify, we need to have science verified, we need to know who's who on the internet. Policymakers, funders, and institutions have an important role to play in that topic too. We need greater focus on communicating science. Trust in science needs to be addressed more systematically. It needs to be reinforced.